There's a garden technique that was old before the first Europeans set foot in Appalachia. It was developed by indigenous farmers over thousands of years, refined into one of the most efficient food production systems anywhere in the world, and adopted by the mountain settlers who learned it from the people who had been farming the land long before them. A quarter acre, planted in the Three Sisters method, can feed a family of 4 for a year. That's not a slogan. It's a real number, supported by historical yields and modern small farm research. And the method works because 3 plants, grown together, do something none of them can do alone. Here's what the Three Sisters garden is, where it came from, why it works, and how to do it honestly today. First, the history, because this matters. The Three Sisters method was developed by indigenous peoples of North America, particularly the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, as well as the Cherokee, Wampanoag, Mandan, and many other nations across the continent. The technique was already being practiced widely when European settlers arrived. The settlers, including the mountain families of Appalachia, learned the method from the indigenous farmers who had been using it for centuries and adopted it because it worked far better than what they had brought with them. The mountain folks added their own touches over generations, particular varieties of corn, beans, and squash adapted to mountain growing conditions. But the core method is indigenous. It deserves to be named that way, both for honest history and because the people who developed it are still here, still farming, and in many cases still teaching this method. With that on the table, let's talk about what the Three Sisters are and how they work together. The Three Sisters are corn, beans, and squash, planted together in the same plot rather than in separate rows. Each plant has a specific job, and the 3 jobs interlock into a system that's greater than the sum of its parts. Corn is the structural sister. The corn stalks grow tall and straight, providing a living trellis for the beans to climb. The mountain families used field corns and dent corns, varieties bred over generations for cornmeal, hominy, and animal feed, rather than the sweet corns we eat fresh today. A good Appalachian dent corn grows 6 to 10 feet tall and produces big ears with dense, dry kernels that can be stored for a year or more. Beans are the nitrogen sister. Legumes, including beans, have a remarkable relationship with bacteria in their root nodules. The bacteria pull nitrogen out of the air and convert it into a form the plants can use, and in the process, they leave nitrogen behind in the soil. A bean plant doesn't just feed itself, it feeds the soil. And in a Three Sisters bed, that nitrogen feeds the corn, which is a heavy feeder that would otherwise quickly exhaust the soil. The traditional beans used were pole beans, climbers, that twined up the corn stalks as both plants grew together. Half-runners and certain heirloom varieties were Appalachian favorites. Squash is the protective sister. Squash plants, usually winter squash, pumpkins, or gourds in the traditional method, spread their broad leaves and prickly vines along the ground around the corn and beans. Those leaves shade the soil, which helps hold moisture and suppress weeds. The prickly stems and leaves discourage some pests, including raccoons and deer that might otherwise raid the garden. And the squash itself produces a starchy, long-storing crop that fills out the family's winter pantry alongside the corn and beans. So the 3 plants, working together, provide vertical structure, soil fertility, ground cover, weed and pest control, and a nutritionally complete set of foods. Corn provides carbohydrates, beans provide protein, and squash provides additional carbohydrates, vitamins, and fiber. 3 crops in the space of 1, supporting each other through the whole growing season. The science behind why this works is well established. The corn and beans benefit from the beans' nitrogen fixation, which is a measured agronomic effect. The squash's ground cover reduces evaporation and soil temperature variation, which has been documented in multiple agricultural studies. And the polyculture itself, multiple species growing together, tends to be more pest-resistant than a monoculture of any single crop, because pests that target one species are less able to spread across an entire bed. If this is the kind of mountain knowledge you want more of, our free Appalachian Almanac goes out every Sunday. One real method, sourced and tested, in your inbox. Links in the description. Now, how the mountain families actually planted this. The traditional Three Sisters plot was laid out in mounds, not rows. The mountain families dug or hoed up a mound of soil, typically about a foot high and 3 or 4 feet across, and planted into the mound. The mounds spaced out the plant groups, allowed drainage, and concentrated the soil's fertility in the planted area. The planting calendar mattered. Corn was planted first, when the soil was warm enough, typically in late spring, when oak leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear by the mountain rule of thumb. Once the corn was about 4 to 6 inches tall and had a good start, beans were planted around the base of each cluster of corn stalks, so the corn would be tall enough to support the climbing beans by the time the beans started to vine. Squash was planted at the same time as the beans, or shortly after, in the spaces between the mounds, where it would spread out and cover the ground. A typical mountain Three Sisters mound had 4 to 6 corn stalks at the center, the same number of bean plants around them, and 1 squash plant in the spaces between mounds. 6 to 8 mounds in a quarter-acre plot, with the squash filling the gaps, was a substantial garden. Enough corn to grind into cornmeal through the winter, enough dry beans to feed the family for months, and enough winter squash to fill the root cellar. A few things have to go right for this method to work, and the mountain families learned them through hard experience. Timing the planting matters. Plant the beans too early and they don't have the corn to climb. Plant the corn too late, and the beans climb past the top before the corn catches up. Plant the squash too thickly, and it can outcompete young corn for sunlight at the soil level. The traditional staggered planting, corn first, beans once the corn is established, squash to fill in, solves these timing problems. Variety selection matters. The method was developed for and works best with traditional pole beans that climb, traditional field or dent corns that grow tall and sturdy, and winter squash or pumpkins that vine along the ground. Modern bush beans don't climb. Modern sweet corn often isn't tall or sturdy enough. Modern summer squash bushes up rather than running. If you're trying this, source heirloom varieties suited to the method. Most seed companies sell Three Sisters specific seed mixes now. Soil preparation matters. The Three Sisters is forgiving of mediocre soil over time because the beans build fertility, but a starting plot benefits from a good base of compost or aged manure worked in before planting. The mountain families had chicken manure, hog manure, and the contents of the privy compost pile, all worked into the garden before spring planting. The honest caveats. The Three Sisters is not a no-work garden. The mounds need building, the planting needs careful timing, and weeds will still come up through the squash cover until it's well established. It's also a method designed for storage crops, corn, dried beans, winter squash, that you process and put up for winter, not a method for fresh eating year-round. If your goal is a salad garden, Three Sisters isn't it. If your goal is calories for the cellar, it's hard to beat. The deeper lesson is one this whole series keeps coming back to. The Three Sisters wasn't invented by a single farmer one season. It was developed over thousands of years by careful observers who watched what worked and refined the method generation by generation. The mountain families adopted it because it was the best system available, and they kept it going because it kept working. We've largely lost that polyculture intelligence in modern agriculture, which mostly grows one crop per field and feeds those fields with fossil fuel-derived fertilizer to replace what the monoculture takes out. The Three Sisters is the opposite approach. Many crops together, feeding each other and the soil, and modern agricultural research is slowly coming back around to acknowledging what indigenous farmers knew all along. 3 plants, a quarter acre, a year of food for a family, with each plant doing exactly the job it was meant to do. The Appalachian way of growing food, learned from people who'd been growing it longer than anyone, and worth growing again the same way today. The agricultural research on companion planting, the historical references on the Three Sisters method, and seed sources for traditional varieties are all linked in the description. If you want all of these methods in one place, with the indigenous history properly credited, the Appalachian Way Field Guide has 47 of them with the original sources behind each one. Link below. Real methods, real sources, real history. That's the Appalachian Way. We'll see you Friday.